In the gray light before dawn on April 4, 1945, the men of the 3rd United States Army were moving so fast across central Germany that many no longer believed the war could last much longer. American tanks rumbled through narrow roads.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Lined with shattered farmhouses, half-tracks splashed through mud left by cold spring rain. Infantrymen marched with the heavy confidence of soldiers who knew the enemy was collapsing. The German front was breaking everywhere. Town after town was falling. But near the small Bavarian city of Aschaffenburg, one patrol found something that stopped hardened combat veterans in their tracks. It began with a smell. Not the familiar smell of diesel fuel, wet earth, and burnt powder. This was something worse. A sick, sweet odor drifting from a cluster of abandoned wooden sheds behind a former German military compound. The first Americans approached cautiously, rifles ready. They expected snipers or booby traps. Instead, they found human beings. At first, the figures inside barely looked alive. American soldiers in torn uniforms lay on filthy straw. Their faces were hollow, their cheeks were sunken to the bone. Several had wrists wrapped in bloody rags where ropes had cut through skin. One lieutenant from Ohio had 2 broken fingers and burns on his chest. Another man, a staff sergeant from Texas, had deep bruises across his back and could not stand. A medic knelt beside them and looked up at the infantry captain with an expression he would never forget. These men had not simply been prisoners of war. They had been tortured. Some had been beaten during interrogation. Some had been denied food for days. Others had been tied outdoors in freezing weather. One private whispered that 2 Americans were shot after refusing to give information about unit positions. Another said the guards were members of the Waffen-SS, and they had laughed while doing it. The soldiers of the 3rd Army had seen death in North Africa, Sicily, France, and the Ardennes. They had seen villages destroyed and comrades killed. But this was different. These were their own men. American soldiers who had surrendered under the laws of war and were supposed to be protected. The patrol radioed headquarters immediately. Within hours, the report moved up the chain of command. Division staff officers marked the details. Medical teams were dispatched. Witness statements were taken. The names of suspected German units were identified. By afternoon, the report reached the headquarters of General George S. Patton. Patton was in his temporary command post, studying maps spread across a field table. At 60 years old, he was already a legend. His ivory-handled revolvers, polished helmet, and fierce language were known throughout the Allied armies. But beneath the image was a commander who believed deeply in discipline and in the code of professional soldiers. He could be harsh, but he respected the rules of war. When Patton learned that American prisoners had been deliberately tortured, his mood changed instantly. Officers present later recalled that he went silent. That was unusual. Patton was rarely at a loss for words, but for several moments he said nothing at all. He studied the photographs and read the statements from the survivors. Broken wrists, burn marks, exposure injuries, executions. Then his face hardened. He demanded the exact location of the responsible unit. Intelligence officers identified elements of an SS formation that had recently withdrawn through the area. The Waffen-SS was infamous for fanaticism and for repeated violations of the laws of war. Many American soldiers already regarded them as the most dangerous enemy they faced. Now Patton had evidence that confirmed their worst beliefs. He stood over the map, placed a finger on the route of retreat, and issued an order that spread through headquarters like an electric shock. The SS officers and guards responsible were to be hunted without delay. No one involved was to be allowed to disappear into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Every roadblock was to be alerted. Reconnaissance units were to push ahead. Military police were to question all prisoners for names, and if armed resistance was offered, Patton made it clear there would be no hesitation. The order was short, cold, and unmistakable. Find them. For the men who heard it, the meaning was obvious. This was no routine intelligence request. This was a personal directive from the commander of the Third Army. The officers responsible for torturing American prisoners had become priority targets. Within hours, the hunt began. Armored reconnaissance cars moved down secondary roads, stopping columns of German prisoners and separating SS men from regular Wehrmacht soldiers. Interpreters questioned civilians in captured towns. Counterintelligence teams searched abandoned headquarters for documents. Tank crews who had spent weeks fighting toward the Rhine now had a new mission. Somewhere ahead, the guilty were trying to escape. The war around them was collapsing. Adolf Hitler remained trapped in Berlin. Allied forces were crossing the Elbe. Soviet armies were closing from the east. Millions of German soldiers were surrendering. In the confusion, many SS officers discarded insignia and attempted to blend in with ordinary troops. Patton intended to prevent that. At the same time, he drove to inspect the liberated prisoners himself. The survivors were now receiving treatment in an improvised medical station. Army doctors had cleaned wounds and started feeding them in small amounts. Some were too weak to speak, others struggled to remain awake. When Patton entered, the atmosphere changed. The wounded men tried to straighten despite their injuries. Patton moved from bed to bed. He asked names, units, and hometowns. He asked what had been done to them. The answers were direct and devastating. One corporal described being struck with rifle butts after refusing to answer questions. A lieutenant recounted being tied to a post overnight in freezing weather. Another prisoner described watching a fellow American shot during an interrogation. Patton listened in silence. Witnesses said his eyes filled with tears. This was the same general famous for profanity and aggression, standing motionless beside broken soldiers from his own army. When he left the room, his determination was absolute. The search intensified. On April 5, armored elements near Ritzburg captured a German convoy attempting to move south. Several officers wore plain field coats, but under questioning their stories began to unravel. One carried documents linking him to a rear security detachment operating near the prison site. Another had blood-stained notes describing interrogations of Allied prisoners. The suspects were separated and taken under guard. Intelligence officers compared their names to statements from the rescued Americans. The matches were alarming. A Hope Sturmfuhrer, equivalent to a captain, was identified by multiple witnesses as the officer who supervised the beatings. A non-commissioned officer was recognized as one of the guards who carried out punishments. Another SS man had reportedly shot an American sergeant who could no longer walk. Word reached Third Army headquarters. Patton was informed that the principal suspects were in custody. Many expected a dramatic reaction. Instead, Patton gave another concise order: conduct immediate investigation, confirm identities, prepare formal charges. The anger remained, but Patton understood something essential. Punishment carried more weight when supported by evidence. The guilty would not be dismissed as battlefield rumors. Their crimes would be documented in detail. Military lawyers and intelligence officers worked through the night. The survivors were asked to review photographs. Several identified the captured SS officers without hesitation. Written statements were typed and signed. Medical reports described injuries consistent with torture. Additional German prisoners provided corroborating testimony. The case was overwhelming. For the American soldiers guarding the prisoners, emotions ran high. Many had lost close friends in Normandy, Lorraine, and the Battle of the Bulge. Now they were watching men accused of abusing helpless Americans. Some guards needed to be reminded repeatedly that the suspects were to be kept alive for trial. That alone revealed the force of Patton's order. He wanted the guilty found, but he also wanted the truth established beyond doubt. As the Third Army continued advancing east, the larger war thundered on. Cities fell one after another. German resistance grew uneven, with some units surrendering immediately and others fighting with desperate intensity. Yet among Patton's soldiers, the story of the tortured POWs spread rapidly. In tank turrets, foxholes, and mess lines, men repeated the details: broken hands, burns, executions. The effect was powerful. American troops who had already fought for months now felt a sharper sense of purpose. For many, the war became even more personal. They were no longer only defeating an enemy nation, they were avenging men who had trusted the protections of civilized warfare and were betrayed. Patton understood this psychological impact better than most commanders. He knew armies ran on emotion as much as fuel and ammunition. Outrage, if disciplined, could strengthen resolve, but it had to be directed. That was why his order mattered. He did not tell his troops to abandon military law. He told them to focus their fury on identifying and capturing the responsible men. It was ruthless, but controlled. In the weeks that followed, the Third Army overran more camps and prison sites. Again and again, soldiers encountered evidence of abuse and neglect. Each discovery reinforced the sense that the war's final phase was also a race to expose hidden crimes. On April 12, 1945, Patton visited the newly liberated Buchenwald concentration camp Liberation near Weimar. The sights there shocked even veterans of long combat. Patton ordered local German civilians to witness what had occurred. The general's reaction was consistent with what he had shown after meeting the tortured American POWs. Crimes had to be seen, recorded, and remembered. The captured SS officers were eventually transferred for formal prosecution. Some were tried by military tribunals after the war. Others faced additional charges linked to broader atrocities. Exact records varied, but for the survivors, one fact mattered most. The men responsible did not vanish into the wreckage of Germany. They were found. The rescued Americans slowly recovered. Several were evacuated to hospitals in France and later returned to the United States. Some carried permanent injuries. Broken bones healed. Burned scarred. Nightmares remained, but they knew that their testimony had triggered immediate action at the highest level of command. One former prisoner later recalled hearing that Patton himself had ordered the hunt. Whether he knew every detail was uncertain, but the effect on morale was real. The survivors felt that they had not been forgotten. That belief mattered. In war, prisoners often feel abandoned, cut off from their units and from the nation they serve. To learn that the commander of an entire army had reacted with personal fury sent a powerful message. Their suffering counted. For Patton, the episode fit a larger pattern. He was a hard commander who demanded speed, aggression, and discipline. He could be controversial and often spoke in blunt terms. But he believed deeply that soldiers were bound by rules. Prisoners who surrendered were not to be tortured. Medics were not to be targeted. Wounded men were to be treated. When those principles were violated, Patton responded with uncompromising force. By late April 1945, Germany was disintegrating. Battle of Berlin raged in the east. Adolf Hitler would take his own life on April 30. In the west, vast German formations surrendered to the Americans. The Third Army pushed into Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. Among the endless stream of surrendering troops were many Waffen-SS men. To Patton's soldiers, the insignia carried a particular meaning. They remembered the tortured Americans. They remembered the hunt. And they remembered that their commander had treated the crime as a personal insult to the honor of his army. On May 8, 1945, Germany formally surrendered. In Europe, the war was over. Celebrations erupted across Allied lines, but the memory of what had been uncovered in those final weeks did not fade. Veterans spoke of concentration camps, death marches, and abused prisoners. Victory was real, but so was the knowledge of what had been endured. The story of Patton's brutal order survived because it captured something essential about the final campaign in Europe. The order was brutal not because it called for uncontrolled revenge, but because it was relentless. Patton used the full machinery of a fast-moving army to hunt specific men through a collapsing country. He turned anger into action. He transformed outrage into a mission: find them. That simple command reflected the kind of commander Patton was. He moved quickly. He thought aggressively. And when his soldiers were mistreated, he responded with the same intensity he brought to every offensive operation. For the infantrymen who first opened the doors to those wooden sheds, the images never disappeared. They remembered the smell. They remembered the skeletal faces. They remembered fellow Americans who could barely lift their heads. For the survivors, the moment Patton listened to their stories became part of their own recovery. They saw in his reaction that what had happened to them would not be ignored. For the officers who carried out the investigation, it was a reminder that justice on the battlefield required both determination and evidence. And for history, the episode stands as one of the clearest examples of how the discovery of wartime abuse could trigger immediate and focused action from one of America's most famous generals. You can almost feel the atmosphere in that field hospital in April 1945. Outside, engines rumble and artillery sounds in the distance. The war is rushing toward its final days. Inside, wounded Americans lie under blankets, their bodies marked by weeks of cruelty. A general in polished boots moves quietly from bed to bed, asking each man what happened. He listens. He turns. And then he gives the order. Not a speech, not a threat, just a command that sends armored cars, intelligence officers, and military police racing across Germany. Find the men who did this. In the ruins of the Third Reich, there were few places left to hide. And because George S. Patton decided that these crimes would be pursued without delay, the officers who believed they could disappear into the chaos learned a final lesson. The war was ending. But for them, the hunt had just begun.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.